Um, so we'll just do a very brief recap. And as Jane said, the idea here is to recognise that, XR is a thing within a huge, broader palette of things. So we don't need to be, and we shouldn't try and be everything within that landscape. We have a particular theory and a particular objective about things, and that's not necessarily to the exclusion of anybody else's. It's just sort of what puts definition around us and what we do. So what I basically tried to do, and I'll see if we can, I'll see if I can share screen here. Let's see. So I'll try and, so what I've done here is I've just got a shortened, 3 slides out of the previous kind of presentation. So what we want to do, basically what we did in the workshop is we said, let's imagine that where all of the sort of logistical and organising work and mobilisation that we're doing at the moment is wildly successful, and we actually managed to lock down, like a capital city for 7 days. So that's what everybody's focused on, and that's what feels like success. And the warning in all of that is that you don't necessarily win just by doing that. It's kind of, you set a condition for success, but at the end of the day, you've got some decision makers, they're in a room together, and they have to decide what to do next. Do they capitulate and start negotiating with the movement, or do they do something like over the top, like kind of sick the police on us or call out the army or whatever? And that's still a choice for them. That's a sort of a pivotal moment in history. And so a question is, to sort of focus in, that's our moment of truth, really, given the sort of strategy that we've got. And the question is, what things would sort of push those decision makers in one direction or the other? And I'm not sure that we even really got to a final answer to that question, but what we did do is kind of build out a kind of a structure around it, which sort of said that these guys don't make the decision in a vacuum. They make it because in a way that reflects, kind of a whole network of interests and influences that their position depends on. So they're not free to just think whatever suits them and do whatever. They're actually subject to a whole bunch of other kind of pressures and political forces. And so this was the punchline slide here. We tend to see leaders as powerful individuals, but in fact they lead only at the pleasure of their key supporters, which puts a constraint around them. And so the dynamics of support are basically the essence of power. And we know that because of all of the leaders that we've deposed in the last 10 years. They're all people who did something that wasn't to the liking of other key power brokers within their party, and they're no longer with us. So what we did then was try to build a bit of a functional map of what are the kind of the key kind of institutions or individuals that Morrison and Dutton will be thinking about when they make a decision, like the decision to negotiate with Extinction Rebellion. And so we basically brainstormed a bunch of kind of lists, I guess, of those entities. I started off with a very rough version of this diagram, and then since the last the last workshop, I've added in a whole bunch of extra boxes. Now, when we did this exercise and we got the list, we got like many extra boxes in a way that this diagram would be like useless, not just in a workshop, but even to try and analyze it just would be too complicated. So but it was very thought-provoking. So what I'm thinking of doing is actually opening up some of the boxes that you see here, because lots of the other things that we thought of actually are elements within those boxes, and that they warrant sort of a further degree of unpacking. But really that would be a whole other workshop, really, to go through it. So the point of all of this is just to say, well, these are all the sort of elements that feed into that decision. And we've got a decision up here: repress, go to the army or negotiate with XR. And we've added a bunch of boxes. And just to go quickly, like kind of what we would then do if we were doing this exercise is go through and kind of go, well, what are the things that XR, which is down here, what are the sorts of boxes that we have direct interactions with? Well, maybe it's the police, maybe it's the parliament and the electorate, perhaps it's the churches and their influence on their consciences. The judiciary obviously is a big one that people talk about. and then whoops, and the other one was kind of the kids of decision makers. It's a sort of seems like an odd one, but I know of at least one case where that was decisive in an elite decision that was, you know, kind of sort of significant, you know, significance in the sort of whole development of sort of Western politics, I guess. So that was really it. That was sort of what we did. That's what we came up with. And I guess I'll throw this one broader. Hello, are we back? My apologies, everyone. Yeah, we're going to broaden that analysis out to kind of like all of the different elements, the sort of the pillars of power that feed into a sort of a status quo, and how different bits of the movement are going to interact with that, and how indeed we can find a place within that. Okay, so I guess I'll hand over back to Jane.
Well, maybe just throw it open for a few minutes. I can see Sergio saying it's important to add that that even if they choose to call in the army, it doesn't necessarily mean we lose at that point. We can still win from that point. Do you want to say anything about that, Sergio?
Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of simple, actually. Like, you know, the army can be a repression tool. That doesn't necessarily mean that, like, we've lost. Like, there's plenty of repression tools they can use. And, you know, Roger basically argues that if your disruption and the repression that is needed for that disruption costs more than what it takes to negotiate, then that's what they do. But that's a sort of simple thing.
Oh, it's a good point. Any other comments that if someone wants to make, or any other like really major things that are that was really all to do with sort of inside the Canberra bubble. It was sort of to do with the mentality of the people who are going to make the decision, whether it's on that day or, as Sergio says, maybe it's, you know, a few weeks later, or, you know, maybe it's not even that round of rebellion, but the one afterwards. But still, it's the same thing. Who inside the Canberra bubble? Brad, have you got a comment?
Yeah, just to add on to what Sergio was saying, if they do use the army or come in heavy with the police, it could be an example of what Dean Sharp calls political jiu-jitsu. They overstretch their powers, and the public don't like the way that the protesters are treated.
Yeah, that's certainly a good point. Oh, and Violet says the army's already patrolling in Melbourne. Oh my gosh. Okay. All right. David mainly talked about the need to split the elites, and that in Melbourne, in Australia, we've never won unless we had at least some of business and one of the major parties on board. And he also talked about the work of Breakthrough in basically working with conservatives, including defence establishment, and also with helping scientists be more strongly outspoken. I talked about the various climate emergency movements in Australia and in the US, and then of course the links with Extinction Rebellion, and the sort of transition that we made in the climate movement in Australia, but starting with campaigns that were mainly focused on forests, renewables, coal and gas. Then the start of the Climate Emergency Declaration campaign, which was focusing initially on shifting the message and gaining eminent person support, which is sort of splitting the elite. We were also trying to work from the outside in, getting states and territories to declare an emergency in the hope that that would put pressure on the federal government. And then almost by accident, we discovered that getting councils to declare was quite powerful as well. And that's how we got the first council in the world to declare, which was Darebin, now 1,700 of them. And the idea that we had was that at each level of government, you'd get a declaration, and as the local government, or whichever level of government it was talking about it more, doing some things about it, you'd grow community awareness, which would lead to more pressure on government and increasingly strong action, sort of going round and round, a virtuous circle. But look, today we're going to move on to the exciting bit, which is basically how we influence this outcome us and the broader climate movement. So, yeah, as I said, last time was sort of like the micro view, and today we're going to do the macro view. All the things that we can do and everyone else can do to make it go our way on that final day. And the first one is the pillars of power, which we tried last time, but I think it was hard on Miro and I hadn't really explained it very well. So we're going to just whip through it, but in a an on-screen way that might be easier. So the idea of the pillars of power is the idea that we've got a broken political and economic system that's held up by a number of pillars. And depending on who you are, you come up with different number and different designations. But broadly speaking, they're usually something about government. So I've divided it this time into federal and state government, separate from local government. Business and the world of finance, banks and all that is usually another one. The whole legal system, including the lawyers and the judges and also the defence forces and the police, is one. Media, mainstream and social media and alternative media. And then sometimes they have separate ones for religion and schools or education. And somebody did raise last time that the whole idea, the sort of colonising mentality and this idea of treating people and nature as expendable is sort of not there in the pillars of power. I think the problem is that it's basically in all of them. It's right across the whole system. So I put that in as a base, as a step there. So hopefully we've got all the main pillars. Is there someone who can, how are we going to do this? If you think we've missed out something really major there, like a really major whole category of things, I think people apart from me can see the chat. So can somebody just call it out if there's a really major thing that is missed out of this, or else I'll just go on to looking at how we can influence these various pillars. Oh, it's weird not being able to see anybody properly. Okay.
Let me just check. I'll check the chat for you, Jane. Hang on.
That'd be fantastic.
Would we include the public as a pillar?
No, because the public influences the pillars.
Okay.
The public pulls them up or pushes them over, pulls them or pushes them. So everything else, all of the movement is not in this yet, and that's, I think, it's one of the things people were finding a bit weird last time. But we're coming to that now because that's the whole point of the next bit. Okay, so I'll go on to the next bit. So how are we going to push over the pillars of power without it all coming down on our heads, you might say? Or this is a quote from Jen Sharp.
So there are a couple of just some points that have come in.
Oh yeah, do you want to say them?
Yes,
Yep.
I will. Yes. So there's international agreements is one that came up last time as well, that people spoke about, like key diplomats as an influence within the sort of Canberra bubble.
Yep, I think we'd put that under legal, but that's a good point.
Yeah, yeah, and a fair point, although again it's probably contained within one of the things, is the sort of the existing soft environment movement might be considered a pillar in our circumstance. And I think there's
well, except that they have no power.
yeah.
They're not being much help. Well, no, they're being some help, as you'll see when we go to all the stuff that they're doing. I think that in the end that there'll be some help.
Yes,
they can be some hindrance as well.
Yeah, that's right. And another point is the invisible nature of the issue to most people, which is also true. Something to kind of emphasize here is that when you do the sort of pillars of power, really what you're talking about is kind of largely, I think, institutional arrangements. So ideas often like inhabit those institutions or are reproduced through them. But what you're mapping is the institutions rather than the ideas, and they're the key institutions of the functional exercise of power within the society.
Yeah. Anyway, it'll get clearer because we're going to just bring in all the people, effectual and ineffectual, that are trying to push and pull at these pillars. But this is an interesting idea from Popovic, that in violent struggles, people are trying to knock the pillars down by pushing them, but we're actually trying to pull them over to our side. Which again, if it's a temple, is a bit weird, but anyway, we've got a movement of movements of sorts. And if just taking the map that I had before Extinction Rebellion came along, you can see that all sorts of people working on local government declarations, there's all sorts of people working on state and territory declarations or climate action in general, all sorts of groups working on shifting the money, all sorts of groups working on getting eminent person support and splitting the elite, and look, mainly us, really on working on shifting it to an emergency message. That is, I think, the weakness of the broader climate movement. But look, we're going to go through it in even more detail than this. We're not going to try and list all the names though, because there must be literally 1,000 and we'll be here all afternoon. We're just trying to get the broad sort of categories and what they're working on. So this is some of the ones I can think of just that are pushing or pulling on the state and federal governments. I mean, there's us and the Coalition of Everyone. There's the whole New Democracy movement. There's a whole lot of people working, of course, on fossil fuels. There's a whole lot of people working on, on renewable energy. There's a whole lot of people working on First Nations sovereignty. Oh, that's spelled Uluru wrong. Climate targets, climate actions, disaster preparedness, all this sort of stuff. Basically, this is just like an attempt to cover just about every campaign that's sort of vaguely relevant, that's all pushing and pulling on the federal and state governments. Same thing, if I looked at anything like really, really major, and we certainly don't want to list all those names, because I think the other pillars are more interesting, like we're always thinking about who's trying to push and pull on the state and federal governments. Local government, there's a few little Extinction Rebellion people working on this, but mostly not. It's mostly local climate emergency groups and local groups just doing stuff like bike paths. But there is an international compact of mayors, and there is a thing that's been formed from the Climate Emergency Council called Climate Emergency Australia. And there are little coalitions, alliances of councils, like the Northern Alliance of Greenhouse, Northern Alliance for Greenhouse Action. Okay. Business and finance, I've got all sorts of groups working, of course, on divestment, on removing funding or insurance from fossil fuels, causing disruption, that's mainly us. Okay, the person who's rustling and not muted, please mute. Removing the social licenses, us and all sorts of people. Carbon risk, there's a thing called the Carbon Risk Disclosure Project that actually is pressuring businesses to have to disclose how much risk they've got, which could bring some crashing down. There's people who are literally investing in various things. There's people trying to protect the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and ARENA, people trying to work to get community solar up, all sorts of businesses that have got together to try and support renewable energy. There's a move that zero by 2050, of course, is everywhere, including in business. And there's some green jobs, hydrogen jobs sort of push from unions on business. Now, any other major business and finance things? All right, let's go on to legal. I don't think I put in the international agreements. I'll put that in afterwards so I don't have to go out of this mode.
Sorry, in terms of business, isn't there insurance companies and even some big business groups talking about needing policy and sort of lobbying the government?
All right, let's I'll just write these down rather than stopping and trying to write them in.
I'm happy to talk to you, Jane, later because I've been mapping it. I'll send you what I've mapped.
Mapping the insurance particularly?
No, just mapping all the climate interest groups and how
Oh, really? Who's that?
Yeah.
I can't say it.
Paula.
Oh, hi, Paula. Okay, great. Well, look, that's why we're whizzing through this, because, I mean, a lot of people have got maps of this. But the main thing, I think, is for us not to be trying to duplicate. Like sometimes people say, oh, why don't we get into divestment? Well, the main reason we don't get into divestment is because someone else is doing it. All right. So legal system, we've got to add the international one. Some of the things we're doing is, people are trying the extraordinary emergency defence. There is outreach to police, lawyers and judges of various kinds. And the main thing, obviously, we're trying to do is clog the system with mass arrests. But yeah, there's a legal challenge to the bond market that some school students have set up, which is a new one I hadn't heard of till a couple of days ago. And yeah, one of the things David was talking about was influencing defence forces. They get that it's an emergency because they're involved in all the emergencies when there's natural disasters around the world. So mainstream media and social media, we're obviously trying to influence with our Tell the Truth strong message. We also do outreach to journalists, not a stack in Australia, but they do a lot in the UK. And we're basically trying to grab the media's coverage with our newsworthy, media-worthy actions. There's groups like Media Watch trying to get accurate reporting without much success. There's certainly all sorts of alternative media. There's some people, I think, working on media ownership laws, which would be a big one if anyone ever managed to win. They don't seem to. There's certainly a range of anti-Murdoch campaigns as well as ours. And there's a few people trying to support whistleblowers, which is sort of a related media-ish kind of thing. Any other big ones? No? And look, I've just put in sort of schools, religion and all that. In other countries, that's often quite big. I don't know that it really is that big here, but I think there are, you know, groups working on that general, the idea that I put at the base, this idea of people as expendable. I don't know that anyone's working on massive disparities of wealth in Australia, which is sort of strange. And
The socialist, Jan?
Sorry?
The socialists are really on top of that wealth disparity and class disparity.
Okay, so they're working on it. That's true. Okay. And look, I left out of one of them. I couldn't quite think where to put it. I mean, there's all that sort of new economy stuff like modern monetary theory, universal basic income, all that sort of stuff. It's got to go in somewhere. It's probably, I don't know what you call it, a pressure on government or a pressure on the monetary system, which is sort of like business. But anyway, I think it needs to go in somewhere.
There's probably another issue here, which is now our right to protest.
Ah, civil rights. All right,
Civil
we'll put that
rights.
in somewhere. That's under legal, yeah.
Would the unions movement be addressing massive disparities of wealth?
I don't think they are very much, do you? I mean, you'd think they would be,
Nope.
but I haven't heard that they are.
They should
It
be.
seems extraordinary because it just gets bigger and bigger.
Our unions are impotent.
Like even the socialists, you know, like I'm just looking at their campaign in the council elections, not a mention of it that I can see. All right, so look, that's the 6 pillars. And now I'm going to do the fun bit in breakout rooms. If these are the pillars of power, approximately, which are the really important bits? Like out of those 50 or 100 things that we just whizzed through there, who's doing the important work? What's the most important work we can do, and what's the most important work that we don't have to do because someone else is doing it, but it is really important?
Tasty forks. That was so good. You're like brains in.
So do you want to start? Are you a report? Who's the report back from your room, Violet?
Andrew.
Probably me, because I was writing stuff down. So we had quite a good conversation, but sort of only managed to concrete a few things. I think there was a strong feeling that XR should be, and you know, kind of engaged at the sort of state and federal level. I think that one went through with consensus. There were, I think it's fair to say, there were mixed feelings about the engagement at the local level. You know, we identified some arguments for and some arguments against, including the fact that it's a space that's well occupied by others. And then there was a strong kind of emphasis on the judicial system and kind of judicial activism, particularly, you know, there's mention made of a thing that I don't know about in New South Wales because it's called a Class 1 form that kind of can elevate you to the Supreme Court, and having kind of strategic people make, you know, cases in that environment. There was a lot of discussion about kind of constituency and collaborative groups, and it's actually can be difficult to distinguish between those, even if in principle there's a distinguishment. So we did mention professional groups who are kind of disenchanted with their inability to speak professionally on the issue. And then the other one that came up was kind of Indigenous land councils, and certainly they have a motivation, you know, to be active on this issue, but they also have genuine sort of, they have a degree, a modicum of sort of institutional power as well. They actually have some rights, which we spoke a little bit about. And then another one that popped up right at the end was that there's the issue of the sort of the degree of kind of connection between sort of finance and industry and kind of in the political parties is obviously a matter of concern. And after workshopping that for a bit, we sort of said, well, the key thing there is that that's actually a rhetorical tool. You know, we wanted to attack that, but you go, well, how do you attack that? And what we sort of came up with was that, in fact, you use it, by elucidating that reality, you actually use it to break the electoral support for the government, for governments. You know, because you're basically saying these guys are, you keep voting for them and they keep selling you down the river. You know, here's the guys that they actually are paying attention to. So the idea there was that kind of electoral, like that sort of reducing electoral support for denialist parties by pointing out that the parties are, you know, kind of they dance to the tune of their paymasters. So that's, I think that covers all of what we got. Is that?
Mm-hmm. That's good. And you did it in 2 minutes, even though I didn't say you only had 2 minutes.
Oh,
If everyone can do it in 2 minutes approximately, we'll do the whole lot in 10 and then we'll be on time. There you go. That's 2 minutes. So who wants to go next? Ben. Okay, off you go, Ben.
Yeah, I can share. Our group our group zeroed in on business, but we did talk about, I guess, the pillars in general and about, is it about pulling them down and replacing them and building new pillars? And we talked about a little bit about regenerative culture as part of an XR strategy, which is about creating a new culture entirely. But zeroing in on the business part of the conversation, there was a comment made about framing the decision making as how much money are we prepared to lose, as in, and so targeting business, as in something like Marketplace is one of those place to do that at the moment, or orgs, I should say. And I'm just reading from the notes I took. So there was a mention of the gas industry might go bust is the current belief. And Jane, do you want to talk about that with Scott Ludlam and impressed by Stop Adani and that it should just, it shouldn't go ahead, and even the size of the gas basin is monstrous. Did you want to elaborate?
Well,
on
it was just, yeah, Scott Ludlam did an amazing video, which I'm trying to get my hands on and share because it's still private, but we can do it. But yeah, he says that Adani should have been a pushover, like, because the Adani family had the money, they didn't even really need to borrow it. They had already some place to sell the coal. So the fact that we delayed it for years on years, he sees as a major victory. I always tend to be a bit disappointed we haven't stopped it yet. But the other thing is just that, yeah, the virus might actually kill the gas industry. So if you manage to kill the coal industry and the gas industry, God, think how much easier campaigning would get. Not that it's guaranteed, of course.
Yeah, so
anything else, Ben?
no, I mean, that links to something you said on the way out, which was Elon Musk's projects about eliminating the fossil fuels industry as well. And we've got, it is business as usual for businesses. They seem to carry on with the blinkers on. So mobilizing the business community, and I was mentioned about possibly hitting, mobilizing small business community and how it's going to affect them, and how, yeah, share information about how it will affect small businesses. We've got, and as well as our mass civil disobedience approaches, I just mentioned, I'm working with business groups that, and we've been trying to shift conversation. So they talk about human-centric design with everything. So shift that idea into eco-centric design. So that was refreshing to hear recently. So if we can get into the psyche of some of these businesses to shift it out of human and into eco, and we always got to be careful not to say eco-centric, so, and challenge the internal workings of these businesses. So,
Okay. So
does anyone want to add anything else?
I think we better not, because that's 2 minutes.
Cool.
I turned off my timer. Who'd like to go next?
I was taking notes and facilitating, so I hope some of my my breakout room will contribute to this, but mine's going to be brief. I think we focused largely on the legal system and about the opportunities that presents over there. There was a specific example which Brad mentioned. I'd like you to talk about that, Brad, if you can, and then Adam as well contributed something to that. But the others, perhaps you can fill in for me.
Okay, Nigel. I was just referring to there was a documentary came out a month ago, maybe a bit more, about the draft resistors during the Vietnam War, called The Boys Who Said No. I think it's extremely relevant to XR. I think it's a template that we can use, provided that we mass mobilise the numbers that we need. When they started out, they were hugely unpopular. They were beaten in the streets. People who were there at the time could probably remember. It was all pretty fresh to me. The public was strongly against them. The government legislated 2-year prison sentences for burning their draft card. Enough of them did. Eventually, thousands of them ended up doing 2 years in jail, to the point where they clogged the legal system up. Public opinion massively shifted against the war for a variety of reasons, but they were definitely significant players in that. And towards the end, judges weren't even sentencing any of these people to jail for burning their draft cards because the system was so clogged up. They employed, you watch the documentary, and it pulls on your heartstrings because they sit in the streets the same way that we do. They block doorways the same way that we do. It's incredibly relevant, and I'd recommend it to everyone. I think there's a lot that we can take out of that, provided we build the numbers that we need.
Jane,
Jane, you're on
Sorry,
mute.
there should be one more group. That was just right on 2 minutes too. Thank you very much. Who's the last group? We haven't had 4 yet, have we?
I was in the last group, so I can go if no one else wants to. We spoke quite a bit. Oh, can everyone hear me? Yeah. We spoke quite a bit about businesses as well. So kind of speaking around, like that's really kind of where we need to kind of push them in terms of them thinking where the best place for the money, where the money's going. And obviously there's already some really good organizations out there doing that, like Market Forces and stuff like that. So we're kind of having a discussion around like where we can fit into that. Yeah, there's not a huge amount more. There was then Andy brought up the point around kind of lack of diversity in XR and that being a problem, and that needs to be something that's addressed. So I guess that wasn't so much on the specific topic there, but that was what was spoken about as well. And then we kind of ended as well on the power of influencers, and I mean XR kind of using that as a bit of a strategy to influence some of these pillars as well. And obviously, I mean, we've seen recently of XR, they've had in the UK some really good influencer engagement and sort of high profile people and celebrities. So I think that's kind of an aspect we could use in Australia now. We're gaining a bit more momentum.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. All right, so we've got that all recorded, which is good because I haven't been taking notes, but that way we can, out of this is going to come some kind of booklet or brochure, anyway, some sort of summary when we've thought this all through and pulled it all together. One thing that yeah, I didn't think to mention in my breakout room, but I think is actually going to be huge, is the Carbon Disclosure Project. Carbon Risk Disclosure Project, which John Hewson is doing. And he's someone who genuinely believes there is a climate emergency. He's not prepared to work with conservatives or do anything to shift them because he's given up on them. He's disgusted. But he's working with the biggest companies in the world to force them to disclose their carbon risks. And again, it's something that could, you know, if you shift those big companies, then it's huge. All right. And Ben would like us to send us his Or can we, if anyone's got them in any form, you can paste into the chat. Could you paste them in the chat? Because that'll be the easiest way to collect them. And then we can put them onto the Miro board after. Hopefully you've got them written down some form or other. If not, take a picture of your rough notes and send it to me. That'll be all right. And one of the things I think we should definitely do in coming weeks or months is to look at some of these strategy books. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes, well, 15 minutes, just almost giving you a taste of them. I think the last one is the easiest to read. The middle one is okay, but a bit hard. And the first one is pretty hard, but it's also fantastic. And of course there are others, but I think we really need to learn from history. So the first one is Why David Sometimes Wins by Marshall Gantz, who organised the Californian farm workers movement. And he's just an amazing, lovely man. So this is just one of his quotes. Movements have narratives, they tell stories, they rearrange meaning. They're not just about redistributing their goods, they're about figuring out what is good. I mean, what a great quote. This guy's gorgeous. So I'm just going to show you a few of his strategy ones, just because that's today. Strategy is how we turn what we have into what we need to get what we want. I like that one. Strategy requires the courage to venture into the unknown and risk failure. And this one's great. Strategy is a verb, something you do, not something you have. An ongoing interactive process of experimentation, learning and adaptation. And we often can't get the information we need to make good strategic choices till we act. I think that's exactly us. And Marshall Gantz is very big on flexibility. The whole story of this group that he formed to organise the itinerant workers in America, they did what the big unions couldn't do and formed this organisation that was very successful with a very, very, very marginalised group. And they had enormous success and they grew really big, and then they ossified and turned into a union and had lots of money and became completely ineffective. So it's an amazing story. Now, the second book is the Chenoweth one, and I think we all know the summaries, but I'll just take you through a couple of her case examples because they are quite interesting as well. They're harder to read because they've got all these dense sort of strange statistics in them. I think she must have been doing a PhD or something. But anyway, this is just two of the case examples. So one is Burma in the 88 uprising. So it was started by students in the capital city. And they had about 1 million people on the streets from all sorts of different people. The military just kept on shooting them. And eventually there was a military coup. Aung San Suu Kyi emerged as a national icon. The junta arranged an election. Her party won 81% of the seats, but they wouldn't recognise the election. And the opposition basically wasn't organised enough to resist, so they lost. She was put under house arrest, but it wasn't lifted till 2010. And I think they had another round then, they did win, but the one that Chenoweth has looked at is this earlier one where they didn't win. And what Chenoweth and Stevens say is that the movement was not united. They had armed groups, which were separatist groups around sort of the edge of the country basically, and then they had the city people, and they weren't really well connected as no sort of unified opposition. And they weren't even supported by the opposition elites. So there were opposition leaders who didn't particularly support the uprising. The Buddhists had a really great network all through the country, but they were too scared. They'd been massively repressed earlier on, and so they just wouldn't do anything. They didn't have much access to the media. There was censorship and media closures. And in the capital, there was a mixture of violent and non-violent rebellion. So, for example, they had these things called jingles, which were basically bicycle wheel spokes that were laced with poison, and they would shoot them at the police. Anyway, the police just kept on shooting them, and there was no backfire, partly, I think, possibly because they had no media access, and there was no defections. Aung San Suu Kyi had a policy of not encouraging defections because her father was in the military and she didn't want to cause trouble for some reason. So they failed to divide the military and the other elites. And basically they just weren't ready. When the election was stolen, they hadn't done the grassroots organising, and they just really couldn't mount any kind of uprising And so that was sort of it. China was supporting the junta, which didn't help, and a lot of the rest of the world didn't really know what's going on. So that's a sort of depressing story. I mean, it really was horrifically bloody. I mean, even before that 1988 thing, they just would shoot like literally hundreds or even thousands at a time. They blew up a student union back in the 60s with thousands of students in it who were yelling insults. But look, still, they had just a long history of bloody repression. And Popovic mentions this 1991 that was successful, but not in nearly as much detail as Chenoweth. So I don't know what happened, but they did in some sense win. Certainly they did a lot better than 1988. Now, in contrast, the happy story is the Philippines, the People Power movement. In 1965, Marcos came to power and brought in martial law after false flag, fake attacks on officials and bomb blasts. He muzzled the judiciary, which up till then had been fairly independent, and shut down the media. There was an attempt at armed struggle, which was communist insurgency, sort of, but also a Muslim insurgency. They were fairly not very much united, but anyway, they also didn't win. But they did form a massive network of groups, all sorts of different groups: workers, peasants, women, students, urban poor, and the Catholic Church was very, very important. So whereas in Burma that had all the Buddhist groups all through the country, but they couldn't use them, in the Philippines they had the Catholic Church all through the country, and that formed their network, and it formed an alternative to the media that they couldn't use. And it also meant that the church leaders enforced very strict nonviolent discipline. So it was a very similar story. In 1978, there was an election and all the opposition groups knew it was going to be corrupt. Some groups argued to boycott it, but some groups mobilised and participated. Aquino was in jail at the time, but campaigned from there. In the 1980s, there was a great big economic crisis, and that together with corruption meant that the elite turned against Marcos. So that just made things a lot easier. So then Aquino was assassinated, and there was a massive, massive event with 2 million people who turned out for the funeral. And this was the start of the uprising. And there were all sorts of strikes, all sorts of civil disobedience over the next few years, building to a peak in February 1986, with 3 days in Manila, and they did in the end win. The reasons, according to Chenoweth and Stephen, is that they were united. They had 200,000 activists, which is pretty amazing, 500 plus organisations, a great diversity of organisations, but all linked into one movement. And yeah, the Catholic Church provided leadership and media. There was a diversity of support and hence a diversity of tactics. And the thing, in contrast with the people of Burma in 1988, after the disputed election, they were ready and organised. They got 2 million at a rally. They announced the triumph of the people, which is a bit like Spring Rebellion. They were going to have several days of just disruptive NVDA and a strike. And the election workers actually defected. They said that the election was rigged. So they had their own people scrutinising, but the people even who were on Marcos's team, they defected and they said, look, it was rigged. So then there was a mutiny that some soldiers tried to bring down the government, but they failed. They were informed on. So they retreated 400 of them retreated to the barracks and barricaded themselves in. And what was going to happen was that Marcos's troops were going to come from other parts of town and from the provinces and take over and take those barracks back. But tens of thousands of ordinary people, despite the danger, came, brought food, and they formed a protective barrier all around those barracks with religious people, basically at the front, nuns and priests kneeling. And they pulled down a radio tower to try and stop the word getting out to the provinces so the troops wouldn't come. But then the word was they were coming. So they put up all sorts of barricades. They got support from the media. and they had a carnival-like atmosphere with this massive barricade of people. And when the Marcos's troops appeared, they actually greeted them with flowers and chocolates and said, look, you've got to join us, which they did. They didn't fight them. And then I think the troops that had been released from the barracks went and took the TV station, that it was a Marcos-controlled TV station, and announced that the people were going to install Aquino, Corazon Aquino, which was Aquino's daughter. So that was a much happier tale. There you see them welcoming the troops, and also the nuns leaning in the front row against the actual Marcos army. But you can see huge, huge, huge rallies. And look, I'm not going to take you through the last book, which is Popovic. You've just got to read it. It is so much fun. So this is almost more like just the chapter headings. It's all about how they organised in Serbia, Otpor, but also how they helped 50 other movements all around the world organise, with just all sorts of creative tactics and a mixture of full-on mobilisation, big events, and then, you know, when they were all getting shot, they'd do something that was dispersed so they couldn't all get shot, but keep the thing going. They used a lot of humour. They did one which involved turkeys with a white flower because the dictator's wife always used this to have this white flower, a bit sexist. But anyway, it involved releasing turkeys with white flowers, and then the police would chase the turkeys because it was disrespectful. And they did another thing with little speakers hidden in really horrible places like smelly rubbish or manure, and they'd play forbidden songs from them, and then the police would have to go and find them in all these smelly places. So what he says is that all the people that have come for advice, they always say, look, you did it in Serbia, but it can never happen here. And so he's got a lot of emphasis on it can, but you're the only people who know how it can be done. Dream big, start small was interesting to me. There's a good chapter on that, which set me thinking about councils actually. Have a vision of tomorrow. Well, we've got that. Bring down the pillars of power. We're working on that. Amazing examples of all these funny actions and backfiring, of course. One of the things that he says, which I think is relevant, and this was the dilemma, I think, in the UK, when they had such success in April, what were they going to do in October? Because he says it's like a band, you know, like the second album. You've always got to move forward to something bigger and better and finish what you started. He talks about two different ways it can go wrong. One, he says in Tiananmen Square, they actually were twice offered really major concessions by the government, and they wouldn't take them because they were too hard line. And then the Russian president was coming to visit, and so they just shot them all, brought in the tanks. So he thinks that's an example of that they should have taken the medium-sized, really quite medium-sized concessions from the Chinese government, and not pushed them into a place where they were going to lose face. And yeah, another example he uses is Occupy. And his thought about Occupy is, first of all, they should have called themselves the 99%, not Occupy, because Occupy is a tactic, whereas the 99% is more of the dream. And they started with their top tactic, having done no community organising to sort of provide the foundation for it. So anyway, this is just some pictures. They made a lot of use of their powerful symbol. This is the Otpor symbol. And as a test of new recruits, they would choose a building, you know, some significant building or, you know, a major square, and they would get the new recruits to go and put the symbol up there, or obviously a lot of postering. They used young women in the front line because the police were incredibly violent. Like they were tortured and raped and beaten up and all sorts of things, but they were less likely to attack the young women. And I don't know exactly what they were doing here, but some sort of protest. So now we're going to move on to critical path mapping, but let's just pause first and see if there's any comments on or questions on that bit. Yes,
So
and he says,
that-
by that logic, does it mean Rebellion should change its name as Extinction Rebellion as a tactic, not the dream? I think we've adopted the branding. It's probably too late to change. Anyway, at least Extinction Rebellion has got the problem and the path to victory.
Yeah, there is that sort of injunction that we can learn a lot, and I really agree with this, from reading all of these things, and we should do so. But that sort of punchline from the Otpor guys that only the local people really know what needs to happen in that local context, I think is a really important one. And as an observation, like I would think that I'd like to make a criticism of the progressive movement generally, so take it in the spirit that it's intended, is that we don't think enough about the nature of Australia as it is rather than as it should be. And we don't think enough about how to engage that and work with like what its potentials are and what its trajectories are. You know, because that's the matrix that we're in. And I'd encourage everybody to start doing that, because we can't, you know, that Otpor thing is relevant. You know, you can't just take stuff from elsewhere and blob it onto Australia and expect it to work. We can learn a lot from it, but we have to synthesize it and adapt it to who and what we are. And it's a very different thing to who, as progressives, we would want ourselves to be. So it's tough. You have to get interested in people that you don't agree with in order to do that. But that's, I think, a very important challenge.
And Violet has another really good point from Otpor. They had different coloured shirts for how many times someone had been arrested. And they actually helped people, like, you know, encourage people to sing in the divvy vans and to do things to keep their morale up, because the prison experience was horrific. But they got different T-shirts for how often they'd been arrested, and it was the coolest thing alive to have a T-shirt that indicated you'd been arrested a real lot of times. But they were just so creative. Oh, Serge got one, and yeah, he's got a cool T-shirt. Good. Yes, Paula points out, similarly to Andrew, that grassroots organising. There's lots of examples in the book of them literally doing things like having events where food was involved to bring along people that wouldn't normally come. You know, trying to get together this unusual set of allies. Any other comments? Yeah. Yeah.
Someone said we should be mixing with those we don't normally. I'm a lawyer, so I'll probably mix with those, you know, part of the evil empire. There's so many disaffected professional groups. They might be a way in, and some small business people are just sucked in by the Morris propaganda. So we've just got to find the more progressive or the more open-minded small business people who, because the momentum has to be everyone. And I agree, and that's what I love about XR. I'm not a rabid person, but this is just so wrong. I'll do anything. Do you know what I mean? So that's the sort of people we need. If we talk to people who are already 3/4 of the way there, I think we can mobilise much quicker. Then I've been arguing with climate change skeptics, and I've just got sick and depressed. And I think that's buying into the vision of the future. That if we have the dream and the vision, that will carry us and other people, instead of attacking what is and going down the gurgler with them. I had a long think about this, because for many years I was opposing everything instead of thinking about what I want and how to go forward. And I don't know why I changed, but that's the XR approach, and it's really empowering. So I just wanted to say that. I hope you don't mind.
Anissa, do you want to talk about that article you posted there? It's a critique of Chenoweth. And look, I mean, I've certainly heard critiques of Chenoweth. I mean, the problem we've got is there is no precedent for what we're trying to do. We're trying to mobilise people to take massive action on something that is not directly impacting them. Like, usually people rebel when they're really poor and downtrodden or massively oppressed personally. We're trying to help them imagine how bad it's going to be in the future and rebel. So it is quite hard. But Anissa, do you want to say anything about that article?
Oh, just that I saw it for the first time today and had a read and wanted to see if other people had come across it, because I found it really interesting, and it actually put forward a bunch of other ways, or like, you know, it wasn't just a critique, it was also like, here are some ideas. And when Andy, or I think it was Andy, who brought up the kind of issues with the diversity in the movement, like what the author of this article was saying was that a lot of the successes in Chenoweth's study were not only kind of not in the same political systems that we were, and also were in kind of countries that were where a lot of the population were already being violently repressed. So therefore, yeah, just a very different situation, but that also they had a very big cross section of a society, and that, you know, as I think a lot of us know, XR can improve on that. And there were a bunch of ideas. So I just, yeah, Andrew, I'd be really interested to hear on your thoughts maybe at another time, but I just thought I'd bring it in because I really liked it. Well, it really helped me think. Yeah, maybe to respond very briefly, it is a great article for sure. And like I said, I think there's a lot of merit in it. I tended to agree with the conclusions. I'd have to read it again to come up with a, like a kind of a detailed response, but I'll put my email in the chat if we want to email about it. I'd love to. I like talking about this sort of stuff. Cool. Yeah. I think one of the things that's worth teasing out is that it sort of says that, like in Chenoweth's examples, typically there's a natural constituency and it's almost everybody. Like almost everybody is the disbeneficiary of repressive regimes. So you've got a huge bunch of people who've got a common interest if only they would realise it. And the question is kind of, as Jane said, that's not probably yet the case. In reality, it is the case if you look long term, but people don't tend to look long term. So we're faced with a much more difficult, you know, if climate change was beating up everybody right now, our job would be relatively easy. But the problem is that it's not, it's only beating up certain people.
On the other hand, I think we have the advantage that, you know, it's going to affect everyone eventually. And that includes the wealthy, whereas it's, you know, often that class divide. Anyway, Brad was next, I think. We've got about 5 minutes left. Do you want to have a go, Brad? And then I can see Kelly after that.
Yeah, just a direct point, and back to that, the draft resistors and the Vietnam moratorium movement. That's why I think that's so relevant, because they are applying the tactics that Chenoweth and Gene Sharp propose and advocate, and they're doing it within a democratic system that is almost identical to ours. So I think that's the example of where those tactics do work within the democratic system.
Kelly, have you got something to say?
Yeah, I just had a couple of points. I think one was off the back of Paula's, is just in terms of like, we should be focusing on those that we can convert, because if in terms of Chenoweth's theory, it's like 3.5% active participation. So it's like really working on those ones rather than trying to convert, you know, skeptics and all of that. And in the second one, I just kind of, in terms of, because I know that I read the article as well and the criticism on sort of using Chenoweth in our example. But if you look at, there was a report done, it's actually a couple of years ago now, but I've just used it for a study, but the fact that the trust in democracy and trust in government has declined like 45% in the last 10 years. That's more the indicator, rather than people being like, climate change is really, you know, affecting me personally. The fact that there's a lot of less government trust and trust in institutions also will help us in terms of Chenoweth's theory being relevant in our situation as well, I think. So I'm quite a strong believer it will work for us as well.
Yeah, I mean, we have probably 2/3 of the population who thinks the system's broken, 2/3 of the population who think that politicians are in it for themselves and not for the rest of us, 2/3 of the population who actually agree that it's a climate emergency, and 2/3 of the population who think we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. There's probably 99% who think that massive inequality is not a great idea. So we've got a good foundation. The problem is that say mainly people are now suffering from the virus or from cutting JobSeeker and JobKeeper more than they're suffering personally from climate. And the only thing we've got at our disposal is storytelling. You know, we have to convince them how bad it's going to be with our stories, because we can't afford to wait until it is really bad, because it's going to be too late. It's not impossible though, because the thing about our brains is that we actually relate to a story not that much differently to what we relate to, how we relate to an experience. Now, I can see Nigel also had some thoughts about that article. Do you want to say anything?
That article did raise some very important issues, I think. Applying it to the Australian context is the issue. I think the examples, the overseas examples, are a bit problematic because many of those movements, I mean, Burma especially, you know, ended up, there were a lot of armed movements within Burma which were regional. But my point is, taking from what I've read so far about movements and what we do here, is that I don't think we pay enough attention to the strategies that have been used locally, and that includes both Indigenous and mainstream kind of political action over the years, because there have been some very successful movements in this country, and that are often not acknowledged, or we don't learn from. But the other thing is that depending on where we're going to in terms of our how wide our strategy, and this is taking into account, you know, what you'd said in your earlier presentation, Jane, about other groups occupying a space which is relevant in terms of the people we try and attract. There are a lot of people who are being exploited by this society, and people who work in the gig economy, for example, and who don't, as far as I know, don't have the political consciousness to, and that's probably a very you know, arrogant way of saying it, of connecting up their predicament with what's happening with the climate, with what's going on in Juukan Gorge, for example. But we know that there are so many connections. Whether or not people will change their views about what they actually do in the end, even if we raise those issues as a group, I don't know. But for me, that taking into account all of those things is you know, would be a more comprehensive way of approaching it. Certainly, I know that that if we don't try and address those things around exploitation of people, I'm just thinking, this might be really trivial, but during this lockdown, the people who have kept us going are the people who work in the gig economy and who are casual workforce in places like aged care. But I also note that to keep the economy going, we're using increasingly non-sustainable materials to keep ourselves going, through takeaway containers or masks and all this sort of shit that we're using. And there's no sense of what impact that's having on the climate. I've seen very little discussion about it outside of here anyway.
Let's move on. It'll be interesting to see how we go with this next section, because this is where we have to imagine the path to victory, basically. It seems like we've got a scattergun of sort of ideas of stuff that might happen and might be important. In the best of all possible worlds, this exercise focuses our minds, well, really it focuses our intuition, because our brains will tell us, well, this is important, and this is important, and this is important, and this is important, and this is important. And it seems like so many things are important, but it's hard to see, you know, which is most important. But if you engage your right brain and your intuition and imagine victory, with a bit of like the way this exercise is meant to work, is that the things that are really important should pop out. Okay. So if we go, well, it helps us imagine what victory looks like, and it crystallizes and communicates our vision of the path. And it also helps us choose tactics, because we can ask, how will this tactic move us along our critical path? So there's probably 1,000 things we can do, but there's only a few things that will help us to victory. So this is a pretty puny example. It's from the person who devised the exercise. If we were going to end plastic bag use in the state, what we're interested in is sort of the milestones, right? Not the tactics. So something you can see in the world. Sometimes people say, what can the dog see? So the first step might be, you might see that there's 5 action groups and that they've formed a coalition, they're working together. The next thing you might see is regular stories in newspapers or magazines. The next thing you might see is people who work in supermarkets urging people to say no. The next thing you might see is the majority of shoppers refusing plastic bags. And then somehow from that, you might leap to the state government passing a ban. Anyway, it's a bit of a low-key example. But the important thing is that it's focusing on milestones, not tactics. Everyone likes to think about and talk about their favourite tactic. If we are thinking, this is an example from before Extinction Rebellion, just from the climate emergency movement when we did it. One of our milestones just in the general climate emergency movement might be that the National ALP conference passes a motion committing to declare a climate and ecological emergency. And we put that down as one of our milestones. We wouldn't worry about which tactic had brought it about. So it might have been something that Labor Environment Action Network did. It might have been a marginal seats campaign. We don't care about the tactic. We just care about the milestone, because if we know what the milestones are, we can come up with the tactics. In terms of us, I mean, obviously having, say, 10,000 people out on the streets, it's sort of a tactic. It's also a milestone. Or having 1,000 groups set up, that's a milestone as well. But things like electric cars becoming cheaper than fossil oil cars, or a big court case win, or the Carbon Disclosure Project, making a whole lot of companies go bust. In this exercise, you're allowed to be optimistic. You know, you're allowed to think that things could work out your way. But the aim is to basically start from the win. And look, the usual way we do this is with paper plates. It's so much easier with paper plates. But you're going to have just someone drawing. The paper plate on the right-hand side is just we win. And I think for the purposes of this exercise, we should just win the declaration of a climate emergency. Don't worry about winning the whole 3 demands, because my guess is we'll win the declaration first and we'll win demands 2 and 3 down the track. If you're super keen, you think you can win the 3 demands in one go, take that as your right-hand paper plate. But then what happens right before you win? Probably a city is shut down. Like it could be Melbourne, it could be Sydney, it could be Canberra. Very interesting to see what your intuition and your imagination tells you about which city is shut down just before we win. Is anything else happening just before we win, like a natural disaster or a court case? Has anything happened in the political parties before then? Like something maybe could happen at the election, or the Liberal Party could split. It's a fantasy exercise. Be generous with yourself, be positive, be optimistic, because otherwise it's not going to be possible to imagine winning. These are some key dates that you might want to think of as you're thinking of your strategy, your critical path. There's a lot of really amazing major things coming up. Well, we've got the Victorian Council elections on right now. If lots of councils got elected favourable to a climate emergency, that is something that might be relevant. If the gas industry does collapse during the COVID-induced depression that we're possibly heading into, that would be amazing. If they get bailed out, not so amazing, but all that's going to play out in coming months. There's, of course, a whole Black Lives Matter movement going on, which is, of course, relevant in Australia. It's possibly going to contribute to civil war in the US, depending on how the election goes. It's a component of the stuff that's all up in the air and unsettled right now. The Narrabri gas field decision is coming soon. The Queensland elections are coming soon. Amazing difference that could make. I mean, it's possible, it's conceivable the Greens get the balance of power in Queensland. That'd make things more interesting. What happens in the US election could help or hinder, especially if they're having a civil war. That'll be interesting to watch from Australia. There's probably going to be a mild bushfire season over summer because it's a La Nino instead of an El Nino. Then we've got the Western Australian election, another fossil fuel resource-rich state. Zali Steggall, Climate Independent, is moving a Climate Act bill early in 2021. There's possibly going to be a federal election later next year. And towards the end of next year, there's going to be the next big UN climate conference. It's going to be in Glasgow. Nicely placed for Extinction Rebellion UK. So I might try and copy those into the chat, just so you've got those someplace you can find them. But again, just let the ones that stick in your head stick in your head. You know, don't worry too much about remembering all of them. So this is your task. You've got 20 minutes. well, till we get a break at 5:05, it looks like. You start from the day that the government declares the emergency and work backwards. And like I said, the milestones from just before and the milestones that lead to that, and come right back to the present. So that's your task. And ideally, you've just got one person drawing it for your room. So let me stop sharing.
Thanks, Jane. I'll be really quick. So I mentioned this in the last strategy meeting, and I've been sort of working on it since. It's a campaign idea that would fit somewhere between Zali Steggall's bill going to Parliament and, of course, being shut down as we know it's going to be, and a potential election in 2021. And it would involve actions targeted at differentiating the parliamentarian from the party. So it's a way of showing that there are probably enough parliamentarians, at least to make a solid block for a climate emergency coalition to act to either win an election by walking away from their party if they need to, or to just sort of say, work as a voting block so that whoever wins, so that there can't be, a majority parliament in the next election. There would have to be Labor with this climate emergency block or Liberals with this climate emergency block. It's basically about changing the numbers, rearranging the deck chairs in Parliament so that we get all the climate realists. That's the wrong term, but all the people who agree that there is a climate emergency in the same voting block or same coalition. So that's my idea.
Okay, and look, we've got a very sensible idea from Jordan. Why don't we take the break first? Because I can feel myself flagging. It means we won't have time afterwards. The task of gathering it all in is going to be a little bit more complicated, but why don't we take the 15-minute break now? And those of us who've got ideas can start drawing them. That was the one with the plates that I maybe just showed you before, which is just about shifting the messaging. But this was one of the big ones that actually resulted in an emergency declaration. It's not the one with mass civil disobedience in it though, unfortunately. I just didn't quite get that up in time. But anyway, it's an example of the kind of thing, like with different paths, different sort of tracks where different things are happening. And because you can't ever work out when the climate events or the random things are going to happen, we just had them like a wavy sea coming in from the side at random times. But you can see how much easier it is probably to do it with paper plates. This was a drawing that was, a drawing of the paper plates afterwards. Anyway, hopefully you're all fired up now. You have either your own paper plates ready to go, or in your head you have them ready to draw on a piece of paper. 15 minutes to work on this and either come up with one collective drawing for your group or several collective drawings, and then I'll give you a warning. Okay, off you go. And now we have the challenge to somehow convey something that may be a drawing. And goodness knows how we'll go, but we'll make a 2-minute limit. I'll tell you when the 2 minutes is up.
Yeah, I'll be really quick. It was a very strange period of time because there were 3 people in the room, and for the vast majority of time, we didn't speak at all. None of us had particularly many things to comment on. When I raised that I was confused about the principle number 1, we have a shared vision of change, because I think I wonder if we actually do, and this relates to what we're doing. I was told that perhaps that was not a conversation that we should talk about the vision. So that made it really difficult for me to understand the landmarks, and so the conversation was shut. But what people did mention was that it is important as a landmark to reach a point where politicians do not openly receive money from the people to make decisions, and if they do, for that to be public. That was something that Serena mentioned. Other than that, I'm not sure. I do think, if I can say one last thing, I do think that for this exercise to be successful, we do need to talk about if capitalism or socialism is the ultimate state. But the conversation they said was irrelevant to this. So, and I should admit, tell the truth, I am somewhat distressed, or I am not feeling very well about this. I am losing hope in this cause because of this. I am a socialist, I should say. And when people say, oh, the socialists before, it shows that we think of the socialists as this group of others. Problematic, I think. But anyway.
No, look, when I was talking about the socialists, I was saying that in some ways they were in the situation you're in and saying we needed mass civil disobedience when that was a really, it seemed almost impossible. It wasn't that people disagreed with it. They just couldn't see how it could possibly happen. But I think the challenge for socialists, especially if the people who say we need socialism first, is how do you win? Like, what are the milestones to winning that in a year or less? I think it's quite hard because we haven't got more than a year or two before it's going to be too late, I would say. Anyway, can we hear another group? Who else have we got? Oh, and Serena says that, is there anyone else who was relatively silent in that room that wants to comment?
Yeah,
Serena,
I was in the.
Commenting in the chat.
Yeah,
Kristen,
I was in the room. We had a kind of a task, and I was excited to come on the call to do the task, and we went a little bit off topic, and so I was hoping to bring it back to the task.
Okay, you didn't manage to draw one, did you? Because don't feel free to just draw one after. It's a shame to let all this input go to waste without some output. Even as people are talking, you might want to just still draw something. All right. Next. Does anyone from the John and David combo want to say something?
Yeah, I'm happy to show the picture that we kind of worked on. I kind of drew it, and John gave some really good insight that I wouldn't have come up with as well. So this is really focusing on the idea that I had and how that could play into getting us to a win in Parliament, a major win in terms of declaration and possibly even something like a citizens' assembly, which I think, Andy, I would say that one of the reasons that XR stays clear of the question of socialism or capitalism or something else or whatever is because it is very divisive, and the citizens' assembly idea is an attempt to overcome those ideological differences in a political situation where that does exist. And it's a reality. We have to accept the reality of where we are.
Okay. Do you want to put it up a bit higher, David? Because we didn't quite
sorry, here we go. Okay.
That's good.
So over here, I'm guessing around February 21 or something like that, we have the Zali-Steggall bill. And over here, somewhere around August, September, maybe towards the end of the year, 21, we might actually have an election because Morrison is feeling mighty confident in the post-COVID era. Here, so the Zali-Steggall bill happens. It gets discussed in the Senate, gets pushed into the lower house for discussion. Zali-Steggall says we must have a conscience vote on this. It's too important. The LNP says no. It goes ahead. It gets a week of media attention, and people were talking about it for a little while, but then it goes away. And what we learn from that, what the public learns from that, is there are a lot of people in Parliament who understand that there's an emergency, but they're incapable of acting. There's something wrong. So we do the emergency coalition campaign, which I described. Over here, sometime after that, maybe April or something along those lines. So that puts pressure on the major parties. It puts pressure on the individuals within those major parties to talk about the climate emergency, to accept the facts and to make public statements along those lines. You get, I mean, if we do it well, it gets a huge public debate. It gets on the media. We get to talk about all kinds of things that we really want to talk about, like the emergency, like how politics is broken, like how the Citizens Assembly solution can solve the problem of the broken politics. We get to talk about the corruption as well. This leads to mass public support because it is definitely not a partisan approach to our federal politics. Most people are not partisan. And if we lay the facts out there as they are, we get to elicit a lot of public support that we might not get otherwise.
You're at 2 minutes, so just
okay.
Get to the end because you get bonus time for actually doing a diagram.
Okay, so we create a lot of tension within the Liberal Party as well as the Labor Party. One note was that, you know, if things move the other way in the Liberal in the coalition as well, like if the Nationals are shedding votes to the shooters and fishers, then the Libs might even flip. Is one of the is the suggestion that John raised. Either way, the major parties have pressure on them to act on the emergency, and that is leading right into an election that Morrison is hoping to win purely on COVID success or whatever, you know, whatever it is that he wants to talk about. And then we get a different result in Parliament. Hopefully we get some kind of emergency.
And I can see that we've got waves of Extinction Rebellion. We get to wave 3 about that time. Is that right? Is that wave 3?
Yeah, so I'm putting
wave 1 and wave 2 are going on in the background.
Wave 3 just before the election. So Perfect. This is kind of a wave 2 action or something like that.
Okay, great. So the waves are building, but there's conscience vote, flushing out the people who actually have a conscience, has changed the dynamics of politics. All right, fantastic. Who's next? Was it Jordan? Were you recording on ours, or was it?
I think
Paula got a hand up.
Sorry, who's got their hand up?
Paula.
Oh, Paula, go Paula. Okay.
You're on mute.
Hi, can I share my screen?
Yeah, I think so.
I'm a bit anal that way. I have a feeling we did a massive fail. I think we did more of a what we want as opposed what's possible. I think that a variety of factors in and around what you're talking about will support the mobilisation that you're talking about. Let me just open my screen. So what I've got to start with, I drafted something, and then I just put down everything we talked about. And I think in the context of, I think what David said was a more practical approach, but I think there are a variety of factors that will make Australia a pariah and put added pressure on us. So I talked about the economic case. The gas industry and the coal industry are already losing value massively. And for example, solar is a lot cheaper at the moment than fossil fuels. I saw that in the Renew thing. So the economic case, once that starts to fail, that's going to be a huge political thing. At the same time, if at Queensland, the Greens get the balance of power, and so the Greens are in there, but at the same time, the federal government's approach next year, in early next year, for trillions of dollars to bail them out, the coal and gas, and the federal government wants to go ahead with that because they argue it's transition, you know, a gas-led transition. So to my view, that will lead to also the public seeing the failure of the politics because the government's not putting the money into the future. I'm going from there to there. I've just jumped. Sorry, I'm going from there, the economic case. So that's the Queensland election. And so you get the public outrage. I'm being more complicated because I'm a lawyer, so I apologise. At the same time,
half a minute, Paula, so don't be too complicated.
Locals coming together and talking about stuff leading to organising and action to build unity and strength. There's a massive fire in the Yarra Valley and the Dandenongs. There's flooding and sea level rise. US elections, Biden wins. Green New Deal, major oil companies nationalised and private wealth of owners taken as proceeds of crime. Jacinta Ardern comes in, Europe comes in, and lastly, one more thing, there's a massive amount of legal action. Sorry, one more thing. I'm totally off the plot. From what I can see, I'm off the plot. But can you see that one with the strategy group? This one here, oops. Action against the government, basically. And then action, so a coalition of professional climate action people sue Sky News for misleading and deceptive conduct, and Alan Jones is sued for defamation by Andrews and the Vic government. So it's pretty, it doesn't really, I don't think we've actually answered anything really, I'm sorry.
Oh, you have. I mean, if you had paper plates, I reckon you've done it. You just had to write one of those on each on a paper plate and the job's done.
But I think that David's is a lot more realistic from a strategy perspective, but thank you for letting me.
We're trying to let our intuitions guide us to the correct answer. In the same way as that group that thought that mass civil disobedience was not a possible action, but thought it was what was required. And maybe it was our little imaginations all getting together in Melbourne in 2016 that created Extinction Rebellion a year or two later. Probably not, but you know, we've got to imagine what we need to do to win. It's no use imagining what will not be sufficient and thinking that's what we should do, which is typical. Sorry, NGO. All right, now who's next?
Okay, I'll go, and Violet and the rest you, because I was writing notes. Okay, so, but I haven't got a timeline like David's, so it's a bit more like Paula's. So circumstances happen next year. James and Elizabeth Murdoch overturn Lachlan, and a rich person buys Murdoch Press because Robert has kicked the bucket, becomes Atlassian Press. There's a huge mobilisation and crackdown that elicits public support because we get a lot of influencers on board. During next year, unfortunately, Queen Elizabeth dies and Prince Charles takes the throne, and all those royalist liberals get told immediately he takes the throne that climate emergency is real. We talked about how it's trying to shift it to become socially unacceptable to be a denier. I actually had that Alan Jones went off air as well. School kids turned to civil disobedience. Yeah, and a major court case is won. A cyclone hits Sydney and we are ready to go.
Yep, we've got wave 1, 2 and 3 sort of building in the background there. And I think, yeah, I've got some ideas from, I think I'm mixing up my groups, but yeah, fantastic. So we've got at least one more to go. Right, Tim's going to go.
So like we had a pretty disparate conversation that I'm trying to like now turn into I guess a bit of a diagram, but I guess it looks something like this. So I guess we sort of spoke a lot, like Paula said, about what we want rather than what will happen. But I've sort of tried to co-mingle that into this like vertical diagram of time. And so it starts with like a watershed moment. And like, I guess, I'm not sure how much of a discussion we had, but I mentioned that one of our watershed moments was the bushfires, and that most of the groups I was involved with were too busy focusing on Autumn Rebellion to do anything about the bushfires when they were happening. And so when that happens again, there's like got to be some sort of response to that watershed moment. That might be something in a Pacific nation nearby, that might be a change in leadership, it might be a new bill, or it might be more catastrophic bushfires, which undoubtedly are going to happen. And when that watershed moment happens, this time we need a response. And then we had a discussion about the waves and whether or not doing it in Canberra or doing it around the nation was going to be the most effective way to bring about the adequate amount of support that we need to make change. And in terms of like discussing it, we had a little bit of consensus that like a movement happening in every city at the same time is probably a more effective way of going about getting that response to the watershed moment to get our demands achieved. However, just because doing it all in Canberra is probably going to be like a bit of an isolated, it's over there, Canberra bubble sort of thing. But nonetheless, going after the politicians where they sleep is also like a watershed moment in and of itself for activism. And then we have this like break in the timeline where we sort of didn't really discuss what order the demands would happen or how they would be achieved. And then I guess we had a further discussion for the last 10 minutes or so about ending, you probably can't read that because my screen's flipped, but the ending the system of co-oppression that we have on one another. And I guess whether or not that system of how we're going to empower each other and stop like being so transactional in the way that we go about getting everything, whether or not that is the outcome of our demands being met, or modeling that is going to be the way that we get that watershed moment to come about in the first place. And so maybe ultimately, in conclusion, the way this would go about would actually be in reverse.
Wow.
Mic drop.
Oh, that's fantastic. So look, I mean, it seems like we've got a sort of mainstream politics stream in a lot of these. So with some at least. Hey, was that the last one? Or is there someone else to still report back? I think that's all, is it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we have like a mainstream politics one, which seems to usually involve the Liberal Party fracturing or flipping. There was one that I don't know whether it got reported back on, that the ALP decided to expel Joel Fitzgibbon based on a movement of young backbenchers who didn't want to fry their future. And yeah, look, there's no reason why all sorts of court cases against Alan Jones or various deniers in the press might not be happening. I'd really love to see like a preparatory watershed moment where we basically do defeat the gas-led extinction, whatever. Because if we don't win on that, then a lot of other stuff's going to get a lot harder. If we do win on that, that's the beginning of a winning streak for the next year. And it's just so pivotal. Like the gas industry and the oil industry is so huge and so destructive to democracy as well as everything else. Anyway, hopefully we've got it all recorded. Some of us who actually like drawing diagrams, I think we'll have to just try and put it into a giant diagram. So we're moving into just, what should we do next, basically. That's an obvious next step. I don't think we need breakout rooms or anything. Just people just want to either write in the chat or put up their hands and say, like, what are our sort of priority tasks coming out of this? I'll just get the chat so I can see it. David's got an idea. I'm just going to write down that first one, which is make a chart.
Yeah, just to get things started, my initial thought is that from this discussion and perhaps other ideas floating around in the movement at the moment, we could really focus our task on setting up some crucial affinity groups who are planning for specific things that we want to have in play at the right time. For instance, the watershed moment that Tim was talking about, we really should have a team who are dedicated to being on top of that so that when the moment comes, I don't know if that's really like, it just seems to me like, we need this kind of, this emergency team, who are ready to deploy at a moment's notice, who are ready to, get the phone chains started at a moment's notice. They need to build that infrastructure. And then there's another affinity group that needs to, plan around the gas-led extinction, which, by the way, that has got to be our slogan. The gas-led extinction, I love it. And so we've already got a number of, maybe what we could call strategic affinity groups or something like that, who are building towards those things so that we don't get lost in the stuff that keeps on coming up that we want to respond to. And we're already behind the eight ball.
All right, great. Is that, are you stretching, Andy, or are you waving? Waving, not drowning, waving. Okay. Who else is actually wanting to speak? We've got Brad.
Yeah. similar to what David was talking about. Pre-COVID, we were talking about doing an action targeting the state government over Vic Forests. And obviously with the second wave, all that sort of dissipated a bit. I think there's a lot of traction in the courts, and there's obviously a lot of walk-ons and things happening in the forests. And I think that's something we really need to do in town and target the state government just to get that back as a mainstream news agenda. And just, I mean, I've got work colleagues that are dead set rednecks, and when you lay out the case to them against Vic Forest, they actually agree with you. So I think that'd be a way to get a lot of people on board, because they can see the madness in what's happening there. And I think that's really low-hanging fruit for us.
Okay. Paula, I think you were next.
I also want to go back to old-fashioned mobilising, because I was looking at the lists of groups, and in my view we need about 4 or 5 times that at the end game. So there has to be people doing the bread and butter of building up the groups, and so that even though there'll be a bigger wave once we do our, wave 3, that if we can just get the people, like the students who finish year 12, talk to them and build up a coalition of the wanting to change things, I just think it's really, really vital, because, and groups intersecting and getting excited and, finding out what other people are doing, so that every climate action group knows one XR group or one person, and it all kind of builds up this excitement that people are losing with COVID. To me, that's the message I got from your 5-second summary of the books. Get that bottom level done, and then the stuff will happen. You know what I mean? That's my humble opinion, since I've only been here for 2 weeks and I'm an expert.
That's what we need. Fast expertise. Who else has got a view on something? Oh gosh, that was so fast. I don't know. Serena hasn't had a go recently. Do you want to have a go, Serena? And then I saw Jordan, and then there's somebody else I missed already. Oh, Nigel's next.
I guess I'm just wondering about process, because we're near the end of the time. I'm kind of wondering whether we need another session to then talk about how to nail this in terms of practical process from here.
Do you want to set a date?
Like 2 weeks from now, again, we just
or maybe
really nail this down into, so we can get the ideas practically into messaging, into strategy, into the mobilisation plan, etc.
3. Can we have it 3 weeks so the council elections are over? I'm just throwing myself into the council elections. That'd be the 17th provisionally. And probably not 3 hours worth, but is 3 o'clock good? All right, so say 3 o'clock for a couple of hours, something like that. Well, we can make it, we can allow 3 hours and then maybe not take it all.
Which day, Jane? Sorry.
Saturday the 17th, 3 weeks from now. But before then, we should just write up some stuff and, think some more stuff and circulate some more stuff. Hey, did everyone sign up via the Action Network thing? Because if you did, then I'll have your email addresses. But if you didn't, then I won't. If you didn't sign up through Action Network, maybe just put your email address in the chat, and we'll just make an email, list, so we can sort of contact each other if that suits. So is it only Paula who didn't sign up for either the thing? All right, so I think I've got Paula's address anyway, but just put it in the chat so I'm sure. God, who was next? Nigel, and then was Sergio, you had your hand up too, did you? And has Violet got her hand up, or? Yeah, okay. I've got no, oh God, and Jordan as well. Crikey. Okay, 1 minute each and out the door. Nigel, 1 minute.
I want to keep alive something that Violet suggested in our little group about the clamping down on civil liberties. And I don't know whether there's some sort of legal action that can be taken out of that, in the sense that we've got a moral obligation to oppose laws which impact on our ability for our future, to speak out about our future. That's all.
All right, thank you. That was only half a minute. But I didn't write down all the names. I know Violet was one and Jordan was one. Just stick up your hand again if I said your name before and I haven't written it down. Sergio, All right, Violet, go, and then Jordan, and then Serge.
Yeah, I just wanted to remind everyone of the importance of like on the street connection to people. It's very easy to become very insular in our actions and not realize that we actually have to talk to people and do that real world stuff. And so continuing with rebel ringing, I think, is really important. There's a whole bunch of rebels who have literally signed up, said I want to get involved, and then don't know how and haven't been contacted. So just keep an eye on that stuff as well. Yeah, thanks.
All right. All the people whose suggestions I haven't written in the chat, maybe can you write them in chat? I'll just put rebel ringing in, but I've missed some because I've been doing other stuff. So next was Jordan.
Yeah, coming back to the exercise we just did, which was a little bit pie in the sky. Intuitively, I feel like for the climate movement to really succeed, there needs to be like a co-movement of like groundswell behind the First Nations struggle for, I guess, more power in the society that we have. And I don't know if that is before or after situation, but certainly something that could be improved with the forests that Brad was talking about. It just kind of piqued my interest again, because there is like a strong coalition there, and it is a strong campaign based on Indigenous sovereignty. So that could be like a watershed moment for both movements in and of itself if it really took off in Victoria anyway. But then there's sort of like a counterpoint to that, is that when we're coming out of the pandemic and talking about economic recovery, it's going to be, I think, a harder push for us to try and shut down industries. Yeah, that's just a side thing. But aside from that, I really am thrilled with David's kind of thing of splitting the existing parties. I think there's room for that, and once we get through the bushfire season, things could get very interesting. And so much has happened already through this pandemic. So yeah, focusing on that.
Okay. Was there someone else in the queue? Serge, go Serge.
Yeah, I think in terms of next steps, it's pretty sort of simple. We need people to quit their jobs and get their schedules clear, to spend their time creating hundreds of local groups across Australia so that we can create 15,000 community organisers in the next 6 months.
How many was that?
15,000? That's 500 groups of 30.
God. All right, 15,000 organisers it is.
Next mobiliser training is on November 12th.
It's going to have to be huge if it's going to recruit that many. Anyway, first, step by step. All right.
Sorry, that's just like our mobilisation base. So that's 30 groups of, 500 groups of 30 people in communities throughout the country, which ultimately act as our base.
A really practical thing too, which I think Paula was maybe thinking of starting work on, is we had, like, this is in Victoria, but I think it's the same in New South Wales. We had about 100 lock the gate groups in Victoria at one point, and they did win against a Conservative government.
And then we lost. Sorry, we just lost with the discussion of gas field all over Victoria. Sorry.
No, there's nothing. The fracking, haven't gone to fracking.
No, it's not fracking. It's just gas fields everywhere. But it's not fracking.
No.
Like, okay. It's not sex. He just didn't have sex with her, okay? He didn't have sex with that woman. Sorry,
we temporarily won, and there still are the remnants of 100 lock the gate groups around Victoria. And I think mapping those and finding those people who are already experienced organisers would be a really good start.
That's
excellent. If we're about to run an anti-gas campaign as one step into mobilisation. All right. How can we check out? Let's just check out one at a time. There's not that many of us. Just check out with just a couple of words about how we feel. And so check out and then just pass it on. That's how we do it. All right. Who'll start? He's a good checker outerer.
Okay, I'll get the ball rolling.
Good on you.
Always happy to see a screen full of happy, rebellious faces, and I'll pass on to David.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, very pumped by all the fantastic ideas here and all the support that everyone's giving each other. And I reckon that this is a good working group. It's beginning to feel like, you know, we're actually making progress, and I'm really looking forward to the next meeting. On to Serena.
You're on mute. Still on mute.
Hold the space bar down, Serena.
If the spacebar doesn't work, you have to click on the Zoom window and then do it.
All right. Maybe someone else should go.
Yeah, really happy to be here and feeling really inspired just by the further national connection and strategy that's coming out at the moment. Interested in where this team goes. And I'll pass to Paula.
So Paula? Oh, okay. I have been in such a negative funk about life, the universe and everything. And I find this really, really inspiring, intelligent, committed people who are planning a future, you know, regardless of whether we're, excuse my language, fucked or not. It's the best medicine. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you.
John, do you want to take it from there?
Yep, thanks, Jane. Energising, as Violet says. I think we've got these competing priorities at the moment, one of which is strategising, the other of which is mobilisation. To me, mobilisation is the main game, and we just cannot take our eye off that. So there may be some need for quarantining some of the strategy thinking so that we all don't get consumed in the intellectual pursuit of a strategy and forget the principal methodology, which is the number of people we can get on the streets.
Okay, and pass it on to Serge. John's muted.
Sure. Yeah, I'm feeling glad that I guess of the group of people here that are meeting to talk about strategy. You're all very intelligent folk that are deep thinkers, and I'm glad you're all here, and I was glad to see my great friend Anissa here as well. So hey, yeah, good. I'll pass on to Nigel. You haven't been, have you?
No, I haven't. Thank you, Sergio. Look, it's been great to be challenged and thinking about all these things with you. I can't really go out because the weather's shit. It's locked down anyway, but it's good to be in this room with all you guys talking about this issue. So thank you.
Passing on to Violet and Andy.
Yeah, I'll leave it up to you guys. We'll just do some mobilising. Good job.
Good, Jordan.
Yeah, thanks for these sessions. It sort of brings up a lot of ideas all over the place, and sometimes I'm like, okay, yeah, so what do we do now? So yeah, I think maybe I sort of felt Serena's point then about process, and I'm kind of left wondering what are the next steps, and is this going to be collated and looked at by a smaller group of people, or are we just going to keep meeting like this regularly, or what the go is? But anyway, I'm sure we can figure that out in time. This is all new, so let's not rush it. But thanks to everyone, I guess, and I don't know. I don't think I have much more to say than that. I'll pass on. I can't see anyone. I'm on my phone. So Jane, do the honors.
Andy A.
Yep. Similarly, I am grateful that we could meet today, and I am looking forward to future meetings. I hope we have them more often than not. I do think that trust is something that I myself have to work on a fair bit, in the sense that I do think that for us to get there, we need to like build relationships of trust. And anyway, I'm conscious of how I'm far from where I want to be. Within the movement, I mean. I'll pass on to Kath.
Thanks. Yes, all really good. I feel like I'm playing catch up with a lot of this stuff. Definitely haven't done as much reading or as much investigation into these things as other people, and it's so great that there's so much knowledge that people have to bring to the table with these sorts of discussions. It always impresses me a lot. So thanks everyone, it's been really good. I will pass to John.
Oh, John's already done his.
Oh no, all right.
Jay, I don't know who Jay is. Jay on Woi or something. Is Jay here? If not, we might do. Christy, have you gone?
Yeah, just wanted to say that was good
What's
listening.
your name, Jay?
Yeah, it's Jam, and just glad to be around and hear people and thoughts and ideas and listen. And yeah, it was just good to sit and listen to people's thoughts and ideas. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, and Christy, have you gone? I've forgotten. You've
No,
gone? They haven't?
no, thank you. It was great being on the call. Lots of complexity, and I guess the only way through is through. And this was another step forward. And a really big appreciation to you and Andrew and Ben for doing the TAC. I know there's a lot of thought and a lot of work put in before coming to these meetings from Jane and Andrew. So I really, really appreciate that for creating the space. So thank you.
And is it, Serena, have you gone?
I know, sorry, I had to take another phone call in the
Oh,
middle of that.
all right. You want to check out?
Yeah, it was great. I really appreciate it. I'm so appreciative of people who've been doing all this strategic thinking, and I'm really looking forward to sort of thinking about how to nail it in the, into our strategy. So thanks everyone. It's fantastic.
I think that's everyone except me.
Me.
Yes.
Little dark face.
Oh, little dark face needs to go. Go little dark face.
You can tell I'm 42 degrees south of everybody because the sun's already gone down. And I wasn't at the last session, so I got to watch the 2 hours Vimeo of the last session this morning. So I feel like I've been in strategy all day, and it's been amazing because it's been like a full day workshop. So I'm really, really pumped. It's just great. Okay.
All right, and now I think it is me.
Anissa as well.
Oh, sorry, Anissa. Go, Anissa.
Oh, good. Sorry, my internet's been a bit crap, so I hope you can hear me. But yeah, I found that really interesting, and it's good to find that there's space in XR talking about strategy. I think there's a lot for me to get my head around and work out. How my thoughts fit into this. And yeah, just a little shout out as well. There's been some of this strategy conversation happening in chats between XR Vic and FLAC Cooler Nations Melbourne. We're trying to create a space to have more of these strategy chats with similar groups. So the next one's late October. So it'd be great to have some minds thinking about strategy coming along so we can learn from each other. So please, and yeah, thanks everybody.
And did I see that Tim hasn't gone?
Yeah, thanks guys. It's so easy with lockdown to get to research and to come up with all these ideas and to have it all here and be like, cool, everything makes sense, but being able to vocalize it and share ideas with people and getting new ideas and this sharing of big picture stuff is so essential. So I've got more questions than I have answers at the moment, but I'm grateful for everyone's ideas, and I'm looking forward to putting them into action. Jane?
Yeah, and look, there is a strategy group working on writing this up as an urgent task, as a discussion paper. I don't know, 3 weeks might be not quite enough to get that done, but you know, at least we have it in mind and we're going to try and work on it. And I just think the power of the group is incredible. You know, I feel way clearer than I was before about a couple of things. I mean, I really think this thing that we do all the cities simultaneously, you know, it just seems really obvious. And that we go hard on this bloody gas-fired extinction thing. However we can, like, you know, we had Violet's warning about all these, you know, laws even in New South Wales that make it hard. But the big groups are actually going on this as well. But they're going to be too timid to do anything in the streets at all. Even if we do the smallest, most dispersed, less than 20-person thing, I think we can still really help with this and build a movement. So
I just think on that, Jane, I think, like, you know, we shouldn't be intimidated and still being the draconian laws and oppression shouldn't make us back down.
No. Well, I mean, that's
my
very
warning is not. Yeah, my warning's about informed consent on hitting the street, not necessarily not doing it.
Yes, no. Serge says that if the laws are fucked, it means our job is easier. And he's certainly a good example to us all in boldness. All right, well, I'll start a little email thing, and I'll send everyone the link to the slides, and we'll have a little folder where all this stuff goes on just Google Docs, and everyone can go and have a look at it, and everyone can go and upload their amazing ideas, and everyone is obliged, especially who did a drawing, to upload their stuff or send it to me if that's easier. Anyway, thanks everybody.
Thanks
Be on
everyone.
the streets.
Thanks,
everyone.
Thanks Jane and Andrew for organising.
Love to meet. Great to meet you all.
Thanks for coming, Anissa.
There's always one who wants to do the group catch. I love it. Okay. See y'all.
Bye.
Paula, you want to join the group? I'll try and remember to put you in the email chat.
Thank you. It's just that as a mass mobiliser, I'm not clear what to do, and I think strategy is a key part.
Yep.
So thank you.
Yep. But there'll be mobiliser meetings, I think, where everything will get clearer too.
Yeah,
but I think in Victoria, we're just not very clear in general about what to do, given that we can't do anything. It's just a bit hard.
But if we plan it, the minute it goes to stage 3, we can run. Anyway, I'll look at your
slides. Where to do the outreach, I think, is really important too. Like, I really think mapping those Lock the Gate groups is a really good start. And then as soon as
I'm part of ARCC, Lock the Gate, Friends of the Earth. I can give you all the.
But where they located is the main thing, because if you see, because the Lock the Gate ones, they literally had a strategy where they they targeted all the towns that were around 300 people.
Yeah, I know.
I was advised to do the survey with.
But it was all the towns in Gippsland that were covered by the licence. And I actually surveyed my town, and we were part of the mobilisers.
Which town's yours?
Murby North.
Oh, you did Murby North.
Because I lived there for 4 years.
North at one point.
My ex-husband is there. I left with the kids, but long story. And so this is now, it's taken me a long time to figure out what I can do.
Yes.
And this is what I can do. But it empowered me in the Work Choices campaign, the Lock the Gate, they empower you with a political win.
Yes, yes. Look, gas and just general mobilisation, gas and extinction, that's us. And I think if you or someone can just find out where those 100 groups were, like at one point they all came to the steps of Parliament House and they had all the time.
We put our little things in a basket and we all thought it was just so amazing.
Yeah. You were there on the steps. I was there too. Okay, so we just got to get just a list of those towns, and then as soon as anyone can mobilise, go and mobilise there. But even before, just mobilise, just get those postcodes in a Zoom call. You know, even if you only find 2 in each place where there used to be Lock the Gate, you know, while it's still locked down, it means you've got 2 to help you organise a talk and get going as soon as lockdown finishes.
Okay, good.
That'll do. That's enough for today.
So excited.
Nice
Thank you
to meet
so much. Your energy is catching.
But the
You know?
energy of the group is catching. I wasn't that energetic before we started.
Okay.
All
I
right.
better let you go. Zoom
Yeah,
overload.
off we go.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.